Tom Hanks finished reading the last line of the letter, set it face down on the desk in front of him, and stood up. He didn't say a word to Jimmy Fallon. He didn't look at the audience. He simply turned, walked to the edge of the stage, and kept walking until he disappeared into the wings. Jimmy Fallon's mouth was open, and no sound came out. 300 people sat completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The cameras kept rolling because nobody in the control room knew what else to do. It was a Wednesday night taping, March 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Tom Hanks was there to promote a new film, his first wide release in nearly 2 years. Standard stuff, beloved guest. A man who had sat in that chair dozens of times across dozens of years, always easy, always warm, always exactly what a late-night host dreams of booking. The audience had given him a standing ovation before he even reached the desk. That was how much they loved him. Tom Hanks crossed the stage with that familiar, easy walk of his, the one that makes him look like he belongs everywhere he goes. Smiled at Jimmy, smiled at the band, settled into the chair with the practiced comfort of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Jimmy leaned forward, and the interview began beautifully. The film, the production, a story about his kids that made the room laugh, a self-deprecating joke that made the room laugh harder. The band played a little riff, and Tom Hanks pointed at Questlove and said something only the two of them could hear, and Questlove threw his head back. The energy in that studio was warm and generous and completely ordinary. A good night. The kind of night that fills the room with easy pleasure and sends 300 people home feeling like they got something real. And then Jimmy Fallon reached under the desk and placed an envelope on the surface between them. Not loud, not dramatic, just an envelope, old. The paper slightly yellowed at the corners. The kind of envelope that has been carried somewhere, and kept somewhere, and carried again. He slid it across the desk and said, "We got this a few weeks ago. Someone wanted you to have it." Tom Hanks looked at the envelope for a moment before he picked it up. He turned it over. He opened it slowly, the way a person does when something inside them already suspects that what they are about to read will cost them something. He unfolded the letter. He began reading. And Jimmy Fallon watched his face, and the warmth that had been living there all evening began to change. Something moved behind Tom Hanks's eyes. His jaw tightened slightly. He kept reading. He read it all the way to the bottom. He set it face down on the desk. He stood up, and he left. Jimmy Fallon's mouth was open, and no sound came out. His hand was still resting where the envelope had been. The audience watched the empty chair where Tom Hanks had been sitting 30 seconds earlier. Questlove's sticks were raised mid-air and stayed there. A woman in the 4th row pressed her hand to her mouth. The director in the control room did not cut to commercial. Jimmy looked at the wings. He looked back at the audience. His mouth was still moving without sound, trying to find a word that wasn't there. Speechless. Completely and entirely speechless in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with what he had just watched happen to a man he genuinely admired. To understand what happened in that studio that night, you need to understand what happened in 1988. Tom Hanks wasn't always Tom Hanks. Not the Tom Hanks who fills stadiums and wins Oscars and makes the world feel slightly safer just by existing in it. In 1988, he was 31 years old, still finding the edges of what he was capable of, still learning that the line between comedy and something deeper was a line you crossed without realizing it. He had done big, he had done punchline, he was working, he was good. But the world had not yet fully understood what it had in him, and neither, honestly, had he. That year, in the fall, He was doing a press run through Philadelphia. Nothing glamorous. A few radio interviews, a small promotional appearance at a department store, the kind of obligation that fills the spaces between the work that matters. He remembers it was October because the trees along the parkway were just starting to turn. He had an hour between appearances, and his driver dropped him outside a diner on Chestnut Street, and he went in to get coffee and sit quietly for a few minutes by himself. There was a man already sitting at the counter who looked to be in his early 70s. Retired, Tom Hanks thought. The kind of man who comes to a diner alone, not because he has no one, but because he has been coming to this diner alone on Tuesday mornings his entire adult life, and he sees no reason to change. His name was Bernard Kowalski. He had spent 40 years as a high school English teacher in South Philadelphia, retiring the previous June. He had a cup of coffee and a folded newspaper, and he was working the crossword in pen, which Tom Hanks noticed immediately. They started talking the way strangers sometimes do in the middle of the day at a diner counter. About the city, about the Phillies, about the crossword. Bernard Kowalski was sharp and funny in a quiet way, the kind of funny that doesn't announce itself. And Tom Hanks found himself forgetting the press run entirely and just being in the conversation. At some point, Bernard told him he had shown big to his senior English class that fall. Tom Hanks asked him why. Bernard said he showed it to every class he had, going back years, not the whole film, just the scene at the piano, the FAO Schwartz scene. He showed it on the last day of every year, and he told his students the same thing every time. He said, "This is what it looks like when a person is completely present. No past, no future. Just this." Tom Hanks sat with that for a moment. He said he had never thought about it that way. Bernard said most people don't think about the things they do from the inside. They only see the surface. He said that was the whole job of teaching, actually. Helping people see what they are doing while they are doing it. They talked for another 40 minutes. When Tom Hanks had to leave, he shook Bernard Kowalski's hand, and Bernard pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. He had been doing the crossword, but on the back of the paper, he had written something down while they were talking. He handed it to Tom Hanks without explanation. It was 3 sentences. Tom Hanks read them standing at the diner counter with his coat half on. He looked up at Bernard. Bernard just nodded once, the way a teacher does when a student finally sees something clearly. Tom Hanks kept that piece of paper. He kept it in his wallet for years, then in a small wooden box on his desk at home, then back in his wallet again during the years when he needed it close. He never forgot Bernard Kowalski's name. He asked his assistant to try to find him twice over the decades. But Bernard was not the kind of man who left much of a trail, and both searches came back empty. The years went on. Philadelphia, Forrest Gump, Cast Away, everything that followed. And Bernard Kowalski taught his senior classes in South Philadelphia every fall until 2019, when he retired again, this time for real, at 82. He moved in with his daughter in Pittsburgh. And in January of 2023, Bernard's daughter found a notebook in his things, a journal he had kept for years that was really just a record of small moments that had mattered to him. 1 page each, written out by hand. The entry for October 1988 was 3 paragraphs long. At the end of it, Bernard had written the same 3 sentences he had handed to Tom Hanks at the diner counter, the ones he had written on the back of the crossword. His daughter read them, and then she read the entry again. And then she sat down and wrote a letter to The Tonight Show. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Tom Hanks had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. 2 weeks before the taping, when The Tonight Show first reached out to his team with the letter Bernard's daughter had sent, Tom Hanks read it in his car on a Thursday afternoon and called his assistant immediately. He did not ask questions about the film promotion. He asked one thing. He asked whether Bernard Kowalski was still alive. He was. Tom Hanks asked that Bernard's daughter be contacted. He asked that she be given 2 seats in the front section of the studio audience for the March taping. He asked that she not be told why specifically. He asked that she be told only that Tom Hanks had read the letter and wanted to say thank you in person. The producers were not told what the letter said. They were not told what Tom Hanks intended to do. They were told there was a guest in the audience, and they marked the seats. Now back in the studio, 30 seconds after Tom Hanks had walked off the stage, Jimmy Fallon stood up from behind his desk. He did not signal the band. He did not speak to the camera. He walked to the edge of the stage and leaned out toward the wings and said, "Tom?" That was all. Just his name. A moment passed. And then Tom Hanks walked back out onto the stage. He was holding the letter in both hands. His eyes were red. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at Jimmy and said, "I need a minute." And Jimmy Fallon nodded and said nothing, because sometimes the only right thing to do is give someone the space they are asking for. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Tom Hanks looked out into the audience. He looked specifically toward the front section, toward 2 seats that the producers had marked weeks earlier. He looked at a woman in her late 40s sitting next to an elderly man who was leaning slightly forward in his seat. The man was Bernard Kowalski, 85 years old, present and alive. His daughter had brought him. She had not told him why they were there, only that it was something special and that he should wear his good jacket. Tom Hanks said, "Bernard." His voice barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone. "Bernard." The old man lifted his head. Tom Hanks held up the letter. His hands were shaking. He said, "Your daughter sent this." Bernard looked at the letter. His face was still. And then something crossed it. Something old and surprised and quiet, the way a person looks when they hear a piece of music they had completely forgotten they knew. Tom Hanks said, "I kept what you gave me. I've had it for 35 years. Bernard said, "From the diner." Tom Hanks said, "From the diner." The studio was absolutely still. 300 people not moving, not one sound. Questlove's stick still frozen midair. Tom Hanks reached into his jacket pocket and held up a folded piece of paper. Old, soft at the folds, the way paper gets when it has been opened and closed hundreds of times. He held it up so the audience could see it without unfolding it. He said, "You wrote 3 sentences. He said, "I have read them probably 1,000 times." He said, his voice cracking, "You told me what I was doing while I was doing it. And I needed that more than you know." Bernard's daughter put her hand over her mouth. Bernard sat very still for a moment, and then he said quietly, "You were a good student." And something in the studio broke wide open. Jimmy Fallon turned toward the audience and could not speak. He pressed his hand to his chest. A woman 2 rows back was openly crying. Questlove put his sticks down on the drum kit and put his face in his hands for a moment, not performing, not playing, just feeling something he had not expected to feel. The cameramen kept shooting because no one told them to stop and because stopping felt wrong. The director in the control room did not cut to commercial. She just watched. Tom Hanks walked to the edge of the stage. He reached down. Bernard's daughter helped her father to his feet, and Tom Hanks took his hand in both of his and held it. He didn't say anything else. Bernard didn't say anything else. Some things don't need more words than the ones already spoken. The audience rose, all 300 of them on their feet. not because it was expected, but because they could not remain seated. A standing ovation that had nothing to do with a film and everything to do with the kind of human moment that television is not supposed to be able to hold. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Bernard Kowalski passed away that August, 4 months after the taping, at his daughter's home in Pittsburgh. He died peacefully on a Sunday morning, with the window open because he liked the sound of the street. Tom Hanks attended the memorial service in Philadelphia. He spoke for 8 minutes. He did not read from the 3 sentences, though he had the paper with him. He said those words belonged to the 2 of them, and he intended to keep it that way. Bernard's daughter framed the letter she had written to The Tonight Show and hung it in the hallway of her house, next to a photograph taken by one of the Tonight Show cameras. Tom Hanks and Bernard Kowalski, hands clasped, the stage lights catching the worn folds of a piece of paper that had traveled 35 years to get back to the room it started in. Jimmy Fallon still talks about that night. He has said in 2 separate interviews that in 15 years of hosting, he has never experienced anything like it. He has said he was genuinely speechless, not in the way that phrase usually gets used, but in the real way, the way where the words simply are not available, because what you are watching is larger than anything language is fast enough to name. Some letters find the person they were always meant to reach. They just take the long way around.